Okay, let's go. Number 10. The Hestdalen Anomaly Protocol. In the winter of 1984, a team of researchers from several Norwegian universities drove into the Hestdalen Valley in central Norway carrying magnetometers, spectrometers, infrared cameras, and an assumption they expected to drive back out with. That whatever was generating the unexplained lights reported by hundreds of local residents since 1981 would, when subjected to systematic measurement, resolve into something recognizable. They called their initiative Project Hestdalen. They arrived as scientists. Several of them left as something else. The lights had been appearing with extraordinary frequency. Between December 1981 and the summer of 1984, residents of the sparsely populated valley reported more than 200 separate sightings of unexplained luminous phenomena. The objects varied considerably in their observed characteristics. Some were white or yellow-white lights hovering in stationary positions for extended periods. Others moved at velocities observers estimated in the thousands of miles per hour, executing direction changes that no known aircraft could perform. Some appeared below the local ridgelines, moving through terrain that would have been physically impassable at those speeds for any conventional vehicle or natural phenomenon. Dr. Erling Strand at Østfold University College was among the first researchers to take the report seriously and methodically. What his team recorded during the initial 1984 field campaigns did not answer the question they had come to ask. It deepened it in ways that some members found professionally unsustainable. The instruments confirmed the lights were real. Radar corroborated visual sightings. Magnetometers detected field anomalies associated with the appearances. Spectrographic analysis indicated the luminous phenomena contained elements consistent with plasma, but a plasma formation with properties falling outside any catalogued natural plasma framework. The objects exhibited a behavioral pattern that recurred with enough consistency across multiple observation sessions that members of the team began logging it separately. When researchers increased the frequency of their monitoring intervals, the frequency of reported appearances from local residents decreased. When the team stood down from active observation, reports from the valley immediately spiked. The relationship between observation and occurrence was inverse, and it was measurable. One researcher on the project, whose name does not appear in the published literature because his contribution was removed from the official record at his own request, submitted internal correspondence to Strand in March 1985 describing experience that has never appeared in any peer-reviewed paper associated with Project Hestdalen. During a night observation session, he observed a luminous object that descended to within several hundred yards of his position, appeared to alter its shape, and emitted a low-frequency acoustic pulse that was felt rather than heard, a vibration in the chest that he described as distinctly purposive in character, as though it was communicative rather than incidental. He left the project 2 weeks after submitting that correspondence. His letter of resignation did not cite the incident. It stated that he had decided to pursue research in a different direction. Project Hestdalen has continued in various forms to the present day, with researchers from Italian and other European universities joining the Norwegian teams in subsequent decades. The lights continue to appear. The instrumentation has improved. The explanation has not emerged. Dr. Bjorn Gittel Hodge at Østfold University has published analyses of photographic data showing the lights emitting radiation across multiple spectra simultaneously in configurations that remain outside any documented natural framework. The project's published papers appear in peer-reviewed journals. What does not appear in those papers is the informal understanding that has formed among field researchers who have spent extended time in the valley, that what is in Hestdalen does not behave as though it is being studied. It behaves as though it is watching. Number 9. The Malmstrom Echo Flight Incident. At 8:45 a.m. on the morning of March 24, 1967, Captain Robert Salas was performing duty as a missile combat crew commander at the Oscar Flight Launch Control Facility at PASSSSSSSSSSS in Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana when his topside security guard called on the interphone with a voice Salas later described, in congressional testimony and in his 2005 book Faded Giant, as unsteady in a way he had never heard from that guard before. There was a glowing red oval object hovering beyond the facility perimeter. It was not making any sound. Within the next few minutes, the 10 Minuteman I intercontinental ballistic missiles assigned to Oscar Flight went offline in sequence, not simultaneously. One by one, as whatever was positioned above the facility moved. The shutdown of a Minuteman missile's launch capability requires a specific and deliberate sequence of failures across multiple independent systems, each with separate power sources and hardened electronics designed to withstand electromagnetic pulse events up to and including the detonation of a nuclear weapon in the upper atmosphere. The probability of 10 independent sequential failures occurring through any random event is, according to the Air Force's own internal probability assessments submitted to subsequent investigations, effectively zero. Robert Jameson, a Boeing missile safety engineer deployed to Malmstrom in the aftermath of the Echo and Oscar flight incidents, was tasked with producing a technical explanation for the shutdowns. Jameson had spent his career designing and testing the exact systems that had failed. He examined the physical hardware. He reviewed the electronic records. He consulted with colleagues at Boeing's Defense Division. The report he submitted was classified. What he told Salas privately, years later, after Salas had spent decades attempting to have the findings declassified, was that there was no electrical explanation. None. The failure cascade could not have been induced by any identified electromagnetic source. He had written that conclusion in the classified report. The report had then been buried. Jameson did not return to missile defense systems research after Malmstrom. He transitioned to commercial aerospace work in the early 1970s and declined, for the remainder of his career, to discuss the technical specifics of what he had found and then watched be officially dismissed. The Air Force's position on the Echo flight incident has remained consistent across 5 decades of Freedom of Information Act, litigation, and congressional inquiry. The shutdowns were caused by a voltage spike in the guidance electronics. That explanation is technically inconsistent with the design specifications of the guidance electronics and with the electromagnetic shielding standards they are required by specification to meet. The Air Force has never acknowledged that a UAP was present. Multiple witnesses have stated under oath that one was. Salas spent 20 years in silence before writing Fated Giant. He has since testified before the National Press Club and before congressional staff briefings, describing the object clearly and consistently across more than 2 decades without meaningful variation in the core details. The mainstream scientific and defense community has not explained the shutdown. It has not released the classified report. The findings of the multiple 1967 investigations into both Echo and Oscar flight, investigations whose existence was itself classified until Freedom of Information Act requests in the 1990s confirmed they had taken place, remain withheld. Whatever Robert Jameson wrote in that report was classified immediately upon submission and has remained classified ever since. When a government classifies an engineering report on the cause of a simultaneous malfunction in 10 nuclear weapons, the most disturbing possibility is not the one they are protecting. It is the one they have decided you will never be cleared to understand. Number 8. The Kecksburg Retrieval. On the evening of December 9, 1965, a fireball was observed traveling over portions of Canada, Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania before descending steeply into wooded terrain outside the small community of Kecksburg, Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. The object was tracked by radar operators at multiple civilian and military installations. It was not a conventional meteor. A conventional meteor large enough to generate the visual profile reported across 6 states would have disintegrated during atmospheric entry and left a fragmentation debris field spread over many miles. What witnesses on the ground found in the woods outside Kecksburg was a single intact object, acorn-shaped, approximately the size of a Volkswagen Beetle, embedded at a shallow angle in a depression in the earth, with no fragmentation debris and no fire, damage to surrounding vegetation of the kind a high-velocity atmospheric impact invariably produces. NASA did not publicly claim involvement in the Kecksburg incident for decades. What internal documents released following a 2003 lawsuit filed by investigative journalist Leslie Keene against the agency established was that NASA had received materials from the retrieval site and categorized them under a file designation used for recovered space hardware of unknown origin. The file was subsequently lost, a circumstance NASA attributed in court filings to routine record disposal procedures. The scientist who first examined the materials was a NASA engineer assigned to the Langley Research Center in Virginia. His name has never been officially released in connection with the incident. What can be documented? Through accounts compiled by investigative researcher Frank Feschino Jr., is that he signed a non-disclosure agreement regarding the Kecksburg materials and retired from NASA 13 months after the incident, at the age of 37, in circumstances that colleagues at Langley found both abrupt and unexplained. What witnesses at Kecksburg reported seeing on the object before military units arrived and cleared the public from the area were markings along the base of the acorn-shaped structure. The markings were described consistently by multiple independent witnesses who did not know one another and were interviewed separately by journalists and researchers in the days following the incident. They described a band of symbols running around the lower circumference of the object that resembled, in their own words, ancient writing, not random damage or scratches. Deliberate geometric characters arranged in a continuous sequence. The Air Force's official position has been that what fell at Kecksburg was a Soviet satellite from the Cosmos series. The Cosmos vehicle most frequently cited in Air Force materials would not have generated the acoustic signature or the visual profile described by radar operators tracking the object's descent. The Soviet Union, when asked directly whether they had lost any hardware in December 1965 over North America, denied it categorically. The consultant metallurgist brought in to advise on the retrieved materials 3 weeks after the event subsequently declined to accept any government contract related to aerospace materials analysis for the remainder of his career. When a researcher pressed him on the subject in the late 1980s, he said only that there were 2 categories of answers to material science questions: answers you could publish, and answers that ended your ability to publish. He did not elaborate further. Whatever was in that debris field in Kecksburg on the night of December 9, 1965, was recovered, transported, classified, and examined by people who then uniformly found reasons to redirect the remainder of their careers. The government has never released an analysis. The materials have never been displayed. The symbols that witnesses described, with geometric precision and evident deliberateness, have never been identified. Something wrote them. Whatever wrote them did not write them for us to find. Number 7. The Trans-en-Provence GEPAN analysis. On January 8, 1981, Renato Nicolai, a retired French technician, was working in a terraced garden on his property near Trans-en-Provence in southeastern France when he observed a craft descend, rest briefly on the earth, and depart. He reported what he had seen to the Gendarmerie Nationale immediately. What distinguished this case from thousands of others was what happened in the 48 hours that followed. France had an official government scientific UAP investigation unit. The Groupe d'Étude des Phénomènes Aérospatiaux Non-Identifiés, known as GEPAN, and operating as a division of the French National Center for Space Studies, dispatched a team of scientists to the site within 2 days and collected physical samples under controlled conditions before contamination had occurred. The site analysis found 2 concentric circular traces in the soil at the location Nicolai indicated, with a central depressed area whose characteristics were consistent with mechanical pressure and high heat. The gendarmerie had already photographed the traces and collected initial samples within 24 hours of the report. More significant than the ground traces were the plant samples. Dr. Michel Bonias, a biophysicist and botanist at France's National Institute of Agronomy Research, known by its French acronym INRA, was tasked with laboratory analysis of alfalfa samples collected from within the landing zone and from progressively more distant control locations. His findings, reported formally in GEPAN Technical Note No. 16 and subsequently published in peer-reviewed literature, were unambiguous in their anomaly and remain unresolved in the scientific literature to this day. The alfalfa plants sampled from within the landing zone showed chlorophyll content reduced by 30 to 50 ash, relative to equivalent samples taken at greater distances under identical soil and environmental conditions. The specific pattern of this degradation was not consistent with drought stress, insect damage, chemical contamination, or mechanical trauma. It was consistent, in Bonias' technical assessment, with exposure to intense electromagnetic radiation in a frequency range capable of disrupting the chloroplast structures responsible for photosynthesis. The damage was most severe at the center and diminished with measurable consistency at greater distances, describing a radiation profile radiating outward from the depression Nicolai had identified as the craft's contact point. No natural phenomenon, no agricultural chemical, and no known industrial process present in that location could have produced the observed pattern of cellular damage. GEPAN's official technical summary stated that the evidence was consistent with the landing of a heavy mechanical device emitting intense electromagnetic radiation of unknown origin. Claude Poer, the astrophysicist who had founded GEPAN in 1977 and designed its scientific methodology, had resigned his directorship in 1978, the year before Trans-en-Provence, after accumulating a growing body of physical trace cases whose collective implications he could no longer contain within any conventional scientific framework while holding an institutional position that required him to do so. Trans-en-Provence, the most rigorously documented of those cases, came after he had already gone. He has since published his conclusion publicly. The evidence across the cases Japan examined, and Trans-en-Provence above all others, represented physical interaction between known matter and something of non-human technological origin. Benowitz continued his academic work at INRA and did not return to UAP-related research. The plant samples from the landing zone remain the only instance in the scientific record of a government research institution producing laboratory-confirmed biological damage to living plant tissue from close proximity, UAP contact, documented under chain-of-custody conditions, analyzed in a controlled laboratory, and published in the scientific literature. Whatever landed on Nicolay property on the afternoon of January 8, 1981, left its signature in the cells of his alfalfa plants. The cells do not lie, and the cells have never been explained. Number 6. The Cash-Landrum irradiation case. What is known without dispute about the evening of December 29, 1980, is this. Betty Cash, 51 years old, Vicky Landrum, 57 years old, and Vicky's grandson Colby Landrum, 7 years old, left a bingo game in New Caney, Texas. Driving home along Farm to Market Road 1485 through the piney woods north of Huffman, and encountered a large diamond-shaped object hovering at treetop level above the road directly ahead of them, emitting downward jets of flame at intervals and radiating heat intense enough to make the exterior of Betty Cash's Oldsmobile Cutlass too hot to touch without protection. Cash later described needing to use her coat to handle the door handle upon returning to the vehicle after stepping outside to observe. The imprint of her hand was found burned into the dashboard padding at the location where she had braced herself while standing through the open door. All three began exhibiting symptoms within hours. Nausea, blistering of the skin consistent with radiation burns, hair loss in amounts that could not be attributed to any acute illness the initial treating physicians identified. Betty Cash's presentation was most severe. She was hospitalized 4 days after the encounter with what physicians treated as an acute viral infection until the symptom pattern, the specificity of the blistering to exposed skin surfaces, the onset timeline, and the scale of the hair loss collectively produced a profile that matched, with clinical precision, acute radiation exposure from a directional source. Cash was hospitalized more than 24 times in the decade that followed. She died on December 29, 1998, the 18th anniversary of the encounter, from causes her physicians attributed to the cumulative biological damage of that night. Dr. Brian McClelland, a radiation biologist affiliated with Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, agreed in 1981 to review the medical documentation compiled by John Schuessler, a NASA project engineer who had independently investigated the case. The analysis McClelland produced was subsequently withdrawn from the public record after being delivered. The findings, which circulated in research copies among a small number of UAP investigators in the early 1980s, described a pattern of radiation injury consistent with exposure to collimated ionizing radiation from a Akana to any known civilian or military device in the United States arsenal at that time. The directionality of the exposure, the specific wavelength ranges implied by the burn patterns, and the dispersion profile across all three victims were not consistent with the scatter characteristics of any known reactor-based or directed energy system. The Cash and Landrum family filed suit against the United States government in 1981, arguing that the diamond-shaped object was a classified military vehicle. The case was dismissed in 1986 on the grounds that no evidence connected the object to any military program. The Army, Air Force, Navy, and NASA all filed affidavits stating no such vehicle existed in their operational inventories. More than 24 independent witnesses in the area that evening separately reported observing the same diamond-shaped object and a formation of military helicopters surrounding it. McClelland withdrew from UAP-related research entirely after delivering his analysis. He asked that his name be removed from the investigation's published record. He continued his academic work at Baylor, but declined all subsequent requests to discuss the case. He found something. The government said it was not theirs. McClelland concluded what it was consistent with, and then he stopped. Number 5. The Skinwalker NIDS deployment. In 1996, aerospace entrepreneur Robert Bigelow purchased the 480-acre property in the Uinta Basin of northeastern Utah that the Ute people had avoided for generations, and that had accumulated decades of documented anomalous activity significant enough that the previous owners had installed hardened steel security posts, reinforced doors, and chains with heavy padlocks on every outbuilding before selling. Bigelow immediately deployed a team from his National Institute for Discovery Science, a privately funded scientific organization staffed by credentialed researchers across aerospace, medicine, physics, and biology. The team included Dr. Colm Kelleher, a biochemist with a doctorate from Trinity College Dublin and prior research work in molecular biology at the National Jewish Medical Research Center in Denver, and Jacques Vallée, a French-born Stanford University computer scientist and astronomer who had spent 3 decades as the most rigorous empirical researcher in UAP science. They deployed with instrumented observation platforms and no assumption that what they would find would be simple. What Kelleher and Vallée documented in their 2005 book hunt for the Skinwalker represented a concentration of anomalous phenomena at a single location without parallel in documented scientific investigation. Cattle were found dead, with incisions executed at a precision inconsistent with predator activity. Cuts made without hemorrhaging, with internal organs removed through openings that veterinary analysis found consistent with laser or microwave cutting technology. Objects appeared in restricted airspace without radar returns. Poltergeist-type events occurred inside the ranch house objects displaced, sounds without identifiable sources, and structured aerial objects, exhibiting multiple distinct morphologies across different incidents, were observed simultaneously by multiple credentialed researchers and recorded on instrumented platforms. What the team found most difficult to formalize in their published reporting was a behavioral pattern they documented repeatedly. The events appeared to respond to their methods. When observation instruments were deployed in one area, phenomena concentrated in uninstrumented areas. When a specific category of event was recorded and the team redirected resources there, that category ceased and a different category began elsewhere on the property. Kelleher said in post-publication interviews that the phenomenon behaved as though it knew what they were looking for and had decided not to be that thing. In May 1997, 2 NIDS researchers conducting a nighttime watch in a field where cattle incidents had been most concentrated observed a bright light emerge from what appeared to be an aperture that opened approximately 5 feet above the ground. The aperture expanded. A large dark figure moved through it. The researchers followed to the fence line. One found a track impression in the mud on the far side that his field report described as inconsistent with any animal species identifiable from his training in field biology. What the track was consistent with was not something he put in the field report. He put it in a private communication to Kelleher 2 days later. Then he requested rotation off the field team. The request was granted. He never returned to the field program. In 2004, Bigelow disbanded the NIDS field team. He subsequently received a contract from the Defense Intelligence Agency to study the property through a program designated AAWSAP. Several scientists who had worked on the NIDS deployment were invited to participate in the government program. Several declined. They did not offer explanations. The declination itself is the explanation. There are things a scientist will investigate and things a scientist will encounter and decide with a deliberateness that no documentation can fully capture, never to stand in front of again. Number 4. The Benowitz Intercept Project. Paul Benowitz held a physics degree and ran Thunder Scientific Corporation, a precision environmental sensing company that manufactured instrumentation for military and commercial clients, including Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where his company maintained active government contracts. He was not a fringe figure. He was a man of methodological rigor, someone who built instruments when he needed data and measured what the instruments returned. When he began observing unusual aerial objects maneuvering over the base adjacent to his Albuquerque property in 1979, he did what his training and temperament both inclined him toward. He built equipment to intercept their signals. The signals he intercepted were real. That fact, buried under the destruction of Paul Benowitz that followed, is the detail the official narrative has most consistently obscured. Benowitz's receivers detected genuine electromagnetic transmissions in frequency, ranges that no approved Kirtland Air Force Base program had been authorized to use. In November 1980, he brought his findings directly to the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, meeting with Special Agent Richard Doty at the base. He was told that the Air Force took his concerns seriously. This was not entirely untrue. They took his presence outside a classified facility with functioning intercept equipment with extreme seriousness, and the response they chose was not to address what he had found. It was to ensure he could never be certain what he had found. Doty later confirmed the campaign to investigative journalist Greg Bishop, whose 2005 book project Beta documents the operation in detail. The strategy was disinformation, systematic and deliberate. Feed Benowitz fabricated documents describing underground alien bases at Dulce, New Mexico. Provide him with falsified communications decoded from signals his own equipment had intercepted, arrange encounters with intelligence assets who confirmed the most extreme interpretations of his findings. Benowitz, whose entire professional identity was built on the scrupulous separation of data from inference, found himself inside a data set that had been specifically engineered to collapse that distinction. He could not determine what was real. He had been right about something. He did not know what, and the people who knew had invested considerable institutional resources in ensuring he never would. He began working 20-hour days trying to reconstruct the signal from the fabricated noise. He stopped sleeping. He became convinced that entities whose transmissions he had detected were inside the power grid of his own home. In 1985, he was hospitalized for acute psychological deterioration attributed to paranoia and exhaustion. He never fully recovered. He died in 2003. Richard Doty has acknowledged the disinformation campaign in multiple public statements. He has never disclosed what Benowitz was actually approaching correctly before the operation neutralized his research. The Kirtland contractor who had assisted Benowitz in calibrating his intercept equipment in 1980, whose name appears in Benowitz's research correspondence but in no published account connected to the case, resigned his government contract in 1981 and left the field of electronic intelligence work entirely. He told a mutual colleague, in an account Greg Bishop compiled through secondary documentation, that what Benowitz had detected was real, and that whoever had made the decision to respond to a physicist's discovery by destroying the physicist's mind rather than by addressing the finding had made a choice that communicated more about what they knew than any official admission ever would. Paul Benowitz went looking for the signal at the edge of what was permitted to be known. They did not silence the signal. They silenced him. Somewhere behind the fabrications, the signal continues. Number 3. The Falcon Lake Encounter. On May 20th, 1967, Stephen Michalak, an industrial mechanic and amateur geologist from Winnipeg, Manitoba, was prospecting for quartz veins near Falcon Lake, approximately 90 miles east of the city, when two oval-shaped craft descended toward his location. One landed on a flat rock shelf approximately 160 feet from where he was working. Michalak approached. He observed the grounded craft for approximately 30 minutes, making notes and sketches in his field notebook of its surface features and physical dimensions. He then moved to within arm's length of the hull. The craft began to depart, and before it lifted off, an exhaust vent at its lower surface emitted a burst of hot gas or radiation directly into his chest. His outer shirt caught fire. He removed it. The craft departed. Michalak found his way to the road and contacted police. The physical evidence documented in the hours and days that followed is the reason the Falcon Lake case occupies a singular position in the scientific literature on UAP physical trace incidents. The burn pattern on Michalak's chest was a precise geometric grid, a matrix of 37 approximately circular burns, each approximately half an inch in diameter, arranged in uniform rows and columns with consistent spacing. The pattern was geometrically specific in a way that eliminated every naturalistic explanation for its origin. No burn source in nature, no accidental exposure to any heat or radiation source, and no form of deliberate self-infliction could produce a grid of uniform circular burns at consistent and uniform spacing without a template. The only template consistent with the geometry of the wounds was the one Michalak had sketched from memory before any physician had examined his chest. The exhaust vent grid he described on the lower surface of the craft. Physicians at the Misericordia Hospital in Winnipeg documented the burn pattern and Michalak's systemic symptoms: nausea, vomiting, loss of appetite, and biological markers consistent with acute ionizing radiation exposure. He was subsequently referred to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, where additional evaluation confirmed the radiation injury presentation and the anomalous nature of the wound pattern. Government investigators from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the Royal Canadian Air Force visited the landing site and collected soil samples from the rock shelf at the location Michalak indicated as the craft's ground contact point. The samples tested positive for elevated radiation above the natural background of the surrounding area, with levels declining at greater distances in a spatial profile consistent with the directional radiation source that the wound geometry on Michalak's chest implied. Dr. Roy Craig, a physical chemist from the University of Colorado, then serving as a principal investigator on the Condon Committee, the federally funded scientific commission tasked by the Air Force with reviewing UAP evidence, examined the Falcon Lake evidence directly. The Condon Committee's official 1969 report described the case as unresolved. In Craig's private correspondence, reviewed by researchers after the committee's disbanding, he described the Falcon Lake evidence as the most compelling physical trace documentation he had encountered across the committee's entire case review. The official treatment of the case did not reflect this assessment. Craig continued his academic career in chemistry and did not publish further on UAP physical evidence. The geometric burn matrix on Michalak's chest, whose specific arrangement matched the vent sketch he had made before any physician had seen his wounds, constitutes a form of physical evidence not susceptible to the interpretive uncertainties that attach to witness testimony. The geometry was in the skin. It matched the drawing. The soil was radioactive where Michalak said the craft landed. And the government scientist who looked at all of it found it the most compelling evidence he had reviewed, and then found reasons not to say so in print. Number 2. The Rendlesham Forest Physical Trace Recovery. In the early hours of December 26, 1980, United States Air Force personnel stationed at RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge in Suffolk, England, encountered a structured craft in Rendlesham Forest, the pine woodland immediately adjacent to both base perimeters. What followed across 3 consecutive nights produced physical evidence that was measured in real time by active-duty military personnel with the full institutional resources of 2 USAF bases at their disposal, documented in a formal memorandum filed by a senior officer to the British Ministry of Defence and partially captured on audio recording while the measurements were being taken. No official explanation has ever been released for any of it. On the first night, Sergeant Jim Peniston and Airman John Burroughs followed the craft into the forest under orders and approached it to within several feet. Peniston sketched the markings on the craft's surface in his field notebook during the encounter itself. When the craft departed, it left 3 physical depressions in the frozen ground arranged in a triangle, each approximately 7 inches deep, with a scorched area at the triangle's center. The depressions were located and measured the following morning by USAF personnel and documented in the official report filed by Deputy Base Commander Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt on January 13, 1981. The Halt Memorandum is not a witness statement or an informal after-action account. It is a formal military communication from a senior U.S. officer to a foreign government describing the discovery of measurable ground traces and the observation of structured aerial objects by multiple USAF personnel over 3 separate nights. On the third night, December 28, 1980, Halt himself entered the forest with a team of airmen, a handheld Geiger counter, and a cassette recorder. He narrated his observations into the recorder as the team moved through the site. The resulting audio, approximately 18 minutes in duration, captures in real time the team calling out the radiation detector readings at successive measurement positions. At the 3 depressions, where the craft had rested 2 nights earlier, the readings were approximately 10 times the natural background radiation of the surrounding forest floor. The recording exists. It has been authenticated. It cannot be a product of retrospective reconstruction or selective memory, because it was made at the location, in real time, in the dark, on the night the measurements were taken. Halt also captured on the recording the team's account of a structured light source, moving through the forest and dispatching beams toward the base's weapons storage area. Peniston and Burroughs both continued in the Air Force following the incident. Decades later, Freedom of Information Act requests produced documents revealing that both men had received classified medical treatment connected to radiation exposure during the Rendlesham period, treatment whose nature had not been disclosed to them at the time. The British Ministry of Defence's own classified assessment of the Halt Memorandum and the physical trace evidence was conducted, but its conclusions have never been released. What the Freedom of Information Act produced was confirmation that the assessment had taken place, that the findings were classified, and that the classification had not been lifted in the 30-plus years since. The scientists and analysts who conducted that assessment are not named in any documents so far released. What they concluded about the radiation readings Halt recorded, about the ground depressions measured the morning after the first night, about the markings sketched in a field notebook in the hours before dawn on December 26, 1980, remains inside a classification that has not been opened. The depressions are still measurably present in the forest floor at Rendlesham. The radiation readings are on the tape. The marks Penniston sketched while his hand was resting against the surface of something he had followed into the forest are in his notebook. The only thing that does not exist in any accessible record is the explanation. Number 1. The AAT IP program resignation. On October 4, 2017, Luis Elizondo submitted his letter of resignation from the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. He had led the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, a classified Pentagon initiative studying unidentified aerial phenomena that had operated from 2007 through 2012 under a $22 million annual budget allocated through the Senate Armed Services Committee at the request of Senator Harry Reid, and that had, according to multiple individuals with direct program knowledge, continued in some operational form beyond the official termination of its Senate funding. Elizondo's resignation letter cited excessive secrecy, bureaucratic obstruction, and a failure of the institution to respond to what AAT-1P had found with urgency commensurate with its significance. He was precise about one thing. He did not frame his departure as quitting. He described it as an act of conscience by someone who had seen the data and concluded that the data was too important to remain inside a system that had chosen not to act on it. What AAT-1P found has been partially disclosed through the official release of 3 declassified video recordings. Each captured by United States Navy F/A-18 Super Hornet aircrews during training operations between 2004 and 2015. The videos show objects performing flight maneuvers that no known aircraft can replicate. Instantaneous accelerations from stationary to hypersonic velocity, sustained operation against 120-knot headwinds without any aerodynamic control surface activity, and stable flight without any visible propulsion exhaust, thermal signature, or acoustic output detectable by the multispectral sensors pointed directly at them during the encounters. Dr. Kevin Nuth, a physicist at the University at Albany, published a peer-reviewed analysis in the journal Entropy in May 2019, calculating the minimum accelerations required for the objects in the FL Lithorandi R1 and Go Fast recordings, based on observed flight characteristics and the documented sensor specifications of the recording aircraft. His calculations returned results ranging from 40 G to 5,000 G. The maximum acceleration a human being can survive for more than a fraction of a quad, second under ideal physiological conditions, is approximately 9 G. Whatever is operating in the declassified footage is not doing so with human biology on board, and it is not operating on any propulsion architecture that leaves a detectable physical signature in any wavelength Navy sensors were measuring during the encounters. Dr. Hal Puthoff, a Stanford-trained theoretical physicist and primary AAT-IP technical contractor through the Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies program, has stated in public forums that the classified technical reports submitted to the Defense Intelligence Agency describe materials recovered from UAP events with metamaterial properties outside the range of any human manufacturing process, atomic-level structural engineering at scales that current human nanotechnology cannot achieve. Those reports were classified upon receipt and have not been made available to any uncleared researcher. The 3 declassified videos are the minimum threshold of what was captured, not the limit of it. Elizondo has stated this directly, in multiple recorded forums, without elaboration. The elaboration is classified. The scientists and engineers who analyzed the complete classified data set from AATIP remain under non-disclosure agreements that have not expired. With few exceptions, they have declined all requests to discuss the substance of what they reviewed. One, speaking to an investigative journalist on condition of anonymity in 2020, said that the most difficult part of the experience was not the evidence itself. It was a specific realization that arrived during a classified briefing session while the data was in front of them and could not subsequently be set aside. The realization was this: the phenomenon had not arrived recently. It had been present here, in our airspace, for a very long time, longer than the programs studying it, longer perhaps than the nation that classified those programs. And it had been choosing, by some mechanism and for some reason that no analysis produced through AATIP had identified, what to show and what to withhold. Elizondo resigned because he believed the truth was too important to keep. The truth, as of this writing, remains classified. And whatever the phenomenon has decided to let us see so far, it has decided we have not yet seen enough to understand why it is here. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.